good to be here with you tonight. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to open up to Joshua chapter 3. Joshua chapter 3 is where we're going to spend almost all of our time tonight. Last week, we dug into a story that you're probably familiar with. If you've studied any Joshua or heard a lesson on Joshua, there's at least a fair chance that it was on Rahab. Right, Rahab is one of the great women of the Bible that gets mentioned. We look forward and see her mentioned in the New Testament and into the lineage of Christ. And so there's a lot of reasons why Rahab gets mentioned. But chapter 3, if you've read on ahead, you know that we're kind of moving along sequentially throughout the book of Joshua. Chapter 3 is one of my favorites. Chapter 3 is, of all of Joshua, I think provides some of the most direct application over to a New Testament Christian's life. Right, we look and we love to be informed by the New Testament, but of course, this is the Old Covenant. They do things a lot differently, and we'll see that tonight, even with the Ark of the Covenant and things like this. That's something that kind of got changed in the New Testament. But there is so much principle here that I think you're going to see and really see the parallel over to our lives now. I want you to think with me quickly, because I've entitled this lesson, The God of an Unlikely Time. The God of an Unlikely Time. And you might think, what does that have to do with Joshua 3? I want you to think with me, and maybe you're familiar with this movie. There's a movie that came out in the late 60s, early 70s. I can't remember. I think it was 69 or 70, called Patton. It won multiple awards. Of course, was chronicling the life of General Patton. And there's a line in there that I always love for a lot of reasons, but I want to read it to you. So this is another general that's looking at General Patton, and of course he is getting promoted in the middle of the war. And so he is a 2-star general that has been suggested to Congress to be promoted to a 3-star general, but you probably remember that any of the general appointments have to be ratified by Congress. That's still true today. So there's a line in this that says, "George," he said, "I know you've been nominated by the president, but that doesn't mean that it has become official until it's been ratified by Congress." Patton calmly replied, "Yes, Congress has its schedule, and I have mine." And the story is, of course, that he went ahead and gave orders that he really wasn't allowed to give, but ultimately saved thousands of lives because he couldn't wait on the decision that needed to be made. You may think, what does this have to do with anything? The children of Israel are going to get marched up to the Jordan River. Remember, they've been wandering for 40 years. But now Joshua has taken the reins from Moses. Remember, Moses is gone at this point. So Joshua is now in charge of the children of Israel. They are getting marched up onto the Jordan River and are having to wait. They're told to wait for 3 days before they're allowed to cross over. Now I want you to imagine putting yourselves in the children of Israel's shoes. Again, they've wandered for 40 years. We're going to know by the context of Joshua 3 that this is more than likely around springtime when the Jordan River, and that's still true today, can get torrential rain at that spot over in the Middle East. And that river, the Jordan River, can become outright dangerous to cross. And many people have lost their lives trying to cross the Jordan River because the exact route that they were taking is still there. And so they're having to sit for 3 days watching this river rise and get faster, and then they're told to cross. I want us to think, and I want us to read Joshua 3, and again, the God of an unlikely time, because God oftentimes has a different schedule than we have. My guess is that many of us share the sentiment of General Patton. God has his schedule, and I have mine. And unfortunately, ours always loses. But we try to make them coincide, and we try to make them gel together. But I want to read Joshua 3, all of Joshua 3. I told you this last week. We won't read every chapter of Joshua, but the shorter ones, especially early on, to get us kind of built up a foundation of the book of Joshua, I'd like to read. And this is only 17 verses here. So we'll look here, and we'll begin in verse 2. So at the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, "As soon as you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. But there should be a distance between you, and it should be 200 cubits in length. Now, I want you to build an image in your mind. A cubit is roughly the distance from your finger to your elbow. That's a rough, and everyone's different, but that's generally about 18 inches. So 2,000 cubits is a really far distance. In fact, we're going to look here in a moment, and I want you to imagine how far away the Ark of the Covenant is ahead of God's people. And we'll look at why they were told to do this. But I want you to imagine the Ark of the Covenant going out 2,000 cubits in length. Again, well over 1,000 feet. It says, do not come near it in order that you may know which way you should go. For you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourself. Another word your Bible might say is sanctify. Consecration and sanctification are very similar. We'll talk about that. But consecrate yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on before the people. So they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went before the people. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all of Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And as for you, command the priests who bear the Ark of the Covenant, when you come to the brink of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. And Joshua said to the people of Israel, come and listen to the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, here is how you should know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out the people of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Jebusites. Behold, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over you before into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men of the tribes of Israel, from each tribe a man. And when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord to the Lord of all the earth shall rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing. And the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, the feet of the priest bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks from the time of the harvest. So that gives us indication it's more than likely springtime. The waters coming down from above and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down from the city of Arabath and the Salt Sea were completely cut off. And the people passed over opposite Jericho. And the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all of Israel was passing on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Joshua, I've told you this before, is one of my favorite Old Testament books for a lot of reasons. Part of it is the imagery that we can walk with the children of Israel from really their wandering into crossing over the Jordan, into Jericho, into the promised land. And it's just one sequential bit of, do we have enough faith to move forward? Do we have enough faith? And again, we look and remember Joshua chapter 2 and verse 24, the spies had returned from Jericho. That was Rahab's story. And it says, and they said to Joshua, the spies back to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. So they began to break camp. They began to travel from where they were holding up to the banks of the Jordan, and they remained there for 3 days while they were watching. Again, at the end of the 3 days, the officers went out among camp. I want us to look through this, and again, I want you to think about God forcing them to stand and to watch this raging river day and night, and trying to figure out how they are going to cross over into this. You know, God could have done this for a variety of reasons. I think the main reason God wanted them to sit and wait was to prove to them that he is the God of the impossible. He's wanting them to wrestle. And again, Joshua 3's got so much parallel to us. How often do we get pressed right up to what hurts us the most? to begin to see and to have confidence that in spite of our fear, in spite of the hurt, in spite of all the things, that God is still big enough to act. God compelled them to wait, to allow the feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, inadequacy to reach its highest level before he begins to come in and do one of my favorite Old Testament miracles. Because not only do we see that God halts the earth, and if you're looking down here and wondering, the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap, what that looks like, people have fought over what that visually looked like. They continue to not have a consensus on this. But what's interesting is as you read through this, it tells us that the heap was very far away at Adam, the city behind Zarethan. If we look at, and even your Bibles probably have maps of Joshua, the city of Adam was almost 20 miles away from the Jordan River. So whatever the heap of water, however that was physically located, God held back water for miles away. And not only did they hold back water, and this is something that you may not notice because we think about God holding water like he did for Moses crossing the Red Sea. But you notice there at the end, the detail of it explicitly says that the priests bearing the ark of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground. That not only did God stop the water, but that God completely dried out the riverbed. That they weren't walking in mud. They weren't walking in even if you can imagine water completely being parted, the ground's still going to be damp, right? An entire river had been there for generations and generations, but God not only dried out the riverbed. I need you to imagine this, because as we think about this, and this is just going to be one of miracle after miracle that God is going to do. Joshua 6, that you're probably familiar with, when God allows the walls of Jericho to come tumbling down. But I want you to imagine the murmuring, the grumbling amongst the people as they're imagining how they're going to cross over here. I think probably what I have highlighted in my Bible as kind of the source quintessential verse of Joshua 3 is verse 15. And as soon as these bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its brinks through the time of the harvest. The waters coming down stood and rose as a very far away. Again, imagine them coming after 40 years of wandering, and they're waiting, and they're ready to cross. We oftentimes ask ourselves, what does God want me to do? Right? I mean, that is a quintessential question of life. What does God want from me? Right? We look and we say, the New Testament is well and good, the Old Testament is well and good, Christ came and died, that's well and good. But how do I reconcile all of that with my life? Not in a hypothetical sense, not in somebody else's life, but how do I put this into practice? Again, I suggest to you that Joshua 3 is one of the most practical Old Testament chapters that we could read, because every single Israelite is wrestling with that very question. What does God want me to do? I'm standing at the bank of a rushing river. After I've wandered for 40 years, am I expected to cross this? Am I expected to not only cross this, but you remember what's waiting on the other side? Though that the land's not empty, right? They're not only going to have to cross this torrential river, but they're going to have to get over there and clear it out of multiple tribes that had been there for a long time. What does God want from me? I think that Joshua called on the people of Israel to do 4 things. And I want to highlight those tonight. I think because all of them are very adaptable to us. We might only get to 3 for time, but I'll tell you all 4. Number 1, they were called to focus wholly and exclusively on God and to follow after his presence. Joshua, at the very beginning, instructed them, watch the ark. Because remember, the Ark of the Covenant very literally was the presence of God. It wasn't a huge box. It was only a couple feet long. But this was the presence of God that was passing thousands of feet up ahead of them. Let's reread verses 2 through 4. Because at the end of the 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the Lord, our ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, being carried by the Levitical priest, set out from your place and follow. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near, in order that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before. You know, the Ark of the Covenant passing ahead was more than just a military maneuver. This was more than just logistical prowess. There's spiritual application to this. This was a very real, the Israelites may not have seen it this way originally, but this was a celebration of God's presence, that God had been faithful to get them to this point. And then you imagine the presence of God going out before them, and they are called to watch. But not only to watch, to be ready, but they're called to follow. You and I look at our lives, and again, 2,000 cubits, that's approximately 1,000 yards. So you imagine 100, you imagine 1,000 yards up ahead of us watching the Ark of the Covenant. And you might be wondering, why would God have them keep that at such a distance? I think partly it was for a few reasons. One, they had such a large group that again, putting the Ark of the Covenant that far ahead they were able to watch where to go. But more than that, it was to focus and force them to fix their eyes on God and on His presence. Because you remember, there's still floodwaters happening. They're still trying to figure out how to logistically pass. And God is saying, don't look at the river. Don't look at the tribes across. Don't look at the 40 years represented behind you. Look at me out in the water, and you follow. I'm reminded of Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews 12 and verse 2 reminds us that looking to Jesus, looking to Christ, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Matthew 14 points us to the same principle, right? This is, of course, Christ out on the water and instructing Peter to come out, but he gives him the same encouragement. He says, come, but Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, Lord, save me. The children of Israel were challenged and encouraged to not focus on the distraction. Easier said than done. But the challenge was, look for the presence of God and follow after that. If you'll do that, you'll be okay. Number two, Joshua encouraged them, ordered them to follow after the presence of God, but he also challenged them to sanctify themselves. Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. That idea of sanctification, of consecration is, we don't talk about it enough. It's very much an Old Testament Levitical, it's a principle that they would have understood well. It has its New Testament parallels, and we read about it in the New Testament, not as often as in the Old. But we look at that word consecrate, and again, your Bible, some of the other translations have sanctify, and they really do mean a very close thing, but it means to separate unto a holy purpose. So Joshua is challenging them. He's saying, forget all the other distraction, forget the frustration of wandering for so long, forget the river, forget the tribes. Set yourself apart for something that was originally meant to be common, to be mundane. That's the purpose of sanctification, of consecration, is taking something that the world that normally would be viewed as regular and make it set apart for God to make it special. Right, I think of, this is not dissimilar from when we read about Moses and the burning bush, right? And we read that the ground that Moses stood on became something special. Before that happened, that was still ground. It wasn't that the item itself was special. It was special because it now became something set apart for God's purpose. God wanted them to be wholly and exclusively devoted to God. We look at this idea of biblical sanctification, of single-minded devotion. And we can look at two types of sanctification. And this probably is a lesson unto itself. But I want to go down this road just for a moment. And if you want to read more on this, come find me. I'll give you a load of books. But there's two types of sanctification that the Bible talks about that when you kind of get up into upper level theology, it's described as two ways. One is positional sanctification. So positional sanctification is just this idea that the believer initially has to go through this sanctification process in salvation, right? That you and I are making a decision to go into the waters of baptism, that we are going to set our lives aside to be devoted to Christ fully, right? We are positionally sanctified next to Christ. And we see this in 1 Corinthians 1, Hebrews 10 talks about this. Through faith, a believer declares this unique relationship with Christ. And of course, we do this through the waters of baptism. But then there's also what's called progressive sanctification. And this is the ongoing process that every one of us goes through, right? That you and I are continually trying to grow and have spiritual growth and be more like Christ. 1 Thessalonians 4 talks about this. 2 Corinthians 3 talks about this. We just got done looking through Galatians. I'd suggest to you that the fruits of the Spirit, remember we looked in Galatians 4 and Galatians 5 talks about that becoming more like the Spirit is that process of turning away the bad and pulling into, like grabbing a hold of the good, the fruits. That's part of this progressive sanctification. That's what Joshua is challenging the children of Israel to be a part of. You know, it's beautiful. Sanctification is kind of a two-way street that we have with God. There's a divine nature to it because, again, God has to be a part of the equation. To be sanctified, to be consecrated, you and I have to set something aside for God. So God has to be a part of it to even allow it to happen. But then the part of it that we don't normally like is our responsibility. You and I have a responsibility to sacrifice whatever it takes to set our life aside and be devoted to God. We see this in the children of Israel. But now we get down to number 3, and this is where kind of the rubber meets the road. They had to step out in faith. They're coming, again, you've heard the phrase, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Right? Joshua had led Israel to the literal water, but they have to choose to take that step. They have to choose to forgo fear to allow themselves to enter into this water. I want to look through, let's read verses 6 through 13. Reread 6 through 13. And I'll call out a couple things just as we kind of look down through this. Starting in verse 6. And Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people." And they took up the ark and the covenant and went before the people. And the Lord said to Joshua, now pay attention here. The Lord spoke to Joshua. Joshua, and this is a little side, but this is part of our understanding. Joshua has a unique position in Scripture. There's only a couple men that we can point to. Moses was another one. It's not only Moses and Joshua, but for our context, we'll focus there. That had a unique position that God spoke to them directly and that they were over the children of Israel. They were the leaders of God's people on earth, that God spoke to them and allowed them to act according to what he said, right? So very different than the New Testament model of leadership where we see the eldership and we see the church as led by a plurality, right? And so this may seem obvious to you, but there are plenty of groups of Christians that would point back to Joshua and Moses and say, but look, this one man led God's people. And that again, that's somehow affirmation that one man can lead the church today. Of course, we see the folly in that all throughout the New Testament, given the leadership structure that the church is asked to have. But Joshua and Moses were in a unique position where they're listening to God directly. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all of Israel." Imagine that. God himself talking to you and saying, today you are going to be elevated among all of my people. And having that responsibility. Joshua is not perfect, but Joshua is a tremendous leader. Because Joshua doesn't care about Joshua being exalted. There's probably a myriad of leadership principles that we could learn from Joshua, but chiefly, Joshua was a great leader because Joshua didn't care what other people praised him. Joshua, at every turn, looked back and said, God is the reason we're here. In spite of our 40 years of wandering, because again, Joshua, tremendous leader, will tell you like it is, and he has some tough conversations with Israel. He saw Moses have some tough conversations with Israel. He's reminded them that the wandering was their doing, right? He's reminded them, Moses has reminded them, you can complain all you want, but we're here because of our actions. I've highlighted this before in sermons. Moses and Joshua always use inclusive pronouns. They will never say, listen to what you did. They will take ownership because they are also part of the children of Israel. They have a unique position, but they are still children of Israel. But he says, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all of Israel, that they may know that I was with Moses and I'll be with you also. Friends, can you imagine what that would have felt like? Standing on the banks of what seems like an insurmountable challenge. We've got to logistically get an entire nation of people. You know, if you look back in history, the nation of Israel is technically known as a geopolitical nation, right? If you go back into the history books, that's what the nation of Israel was called. They were a huge group that is having to move across this river, and then they're going to find enemy after enemy after enemy after enemy. But God points to Joshua and says, Joshua, I was with Moses, and I'm gonna prove to the people of Israel that I'm with you too. But what is required first? Joshua and every child of Israel had to take a step. Right, and we look at this a lot, and so many times, you know, we spend so much time looking and describing and thinking about what it means to be a Christian and how my life might look if I become a Christian and am baptized and all this kind of stuff. But we don't take the plunge, literally and figuratively. We don't take the plunge. We go right to 99% and we stop. You know, we could talk about that with regards to salvation, but let's go maybe even a little more personal. You'd probably hope I would stop. I hope I would stop at that. But the challenge is in all of our lives, we think about being disciples of Christ. The entire phrase discipleship literally means to become more like Christ, to have the characteristics of Christ. So when we start talking about forgiveness, or we start talking about mercy, or we start talking about service or priority or any of these other things that go into being a child of God, all of us have something where we've taken it to 99%, but we're not able or willing to take that last step. And God is going to point to the children of Israel and say, it's fine for you to get up to the banks of the Jordan, but do you recognize the promised land isn't on the banks of the Jordan? The promised land isn't in the water of the Jordan. The promised land is across the Jordan. You got to step, you got to move, or you're not going to get it. And that's true of our lives as well. You know, we look at this, and again, we'll finish our reading in a moment, but we look and God is sovereign. And many times people like to look in Joshua 3 and the rest of Joshua and point out, well, why is God uprooting all these other tribes that have been in the promised land for all this time, and God's not just, and yada, yada. But here's the thing, God, and again, we don't necessarily, we do see this in Joshua. It's not spelled out for us in Joshua, but one of the themes of the character of God is sovereign, which means that his rule extends to every molecule of this world. He has the ability and the right to do whatever he wants. That clearly provides justification to expel anyone he wants from anywhere he wants, and that includes the promised land. Not to mention that the 7 nations that he is going to rule, that he is going to push out, are almost exclusively pagan nations. They have no respect for God. So again, God is sovereign. God owns everything. The land is his to give, and the land is his to take away as he sees fit. So let's finish our reading. Let's just start in verse 8. I forget where we left off. As for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. And Joshua said to the people of Israel, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, here is how you should know that the living God is among you, and he will be without fail. He will drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing before you into the Jordan. Now, therefore, take 12 men from the tribes of Israel, from each tribe, take a man. He told them to stand still and watch. But again, we look in verses 13 and 14. You and I have to take a step. We can focus on God. We can have all the faith in the world. We can consecrate ourselves. We can prepare ourselves. We can sanctify ourselves. We can use all the big language we want. But let's make it practical for us. The children of Israel stood to inherit everything, but they got nothing unless they took a step. You and I stand to inherit a tremendous blessing, but until we go into the waters of baptism, friend, we have nothing. All the prep in the world doesn't equal salvation. And lastly, number 4, Joshua encouraged them, having stepped out in faith, stand still and wait on the power of God. You know, we think about standing still in our modern context, and it's almost become a bad phrase. It almost has become a dirty word for us to be encouraged to wait or stand still or be patient, right? The world we live in is increasingly fast. We got to move. But we look in verse 8 and verse 17. And as for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the water, wait and stand still in the Jordan. Let's jump ahead to verse 17. Now the priest bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all of Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. The portrayal of God's power is incredible. The breadth and the magnitude of it is almost hard for us to wrap our minds around. Again, put yourself there. The waters of the Jordan would have risen to flood levels. Again, you can go and you can watch. I'm sure there's YouTube videos even now. The Jordan River is notorious for flooding terribly, especially in the spring harvest season. That's still there, right? The weather patterns haven't changed. The Jordan can get incredibly bustling. It seems like insurmountable odds. Thousands of Israelites standing on this edge, and they're encouraged to step out. Again, we look and we see God holding up the water miles away after 40 years of wandering. My challenge for us tonight, what have you been unwilling to step into? Again, we think about the phrase discipleship. Discipleship at its purest just means the elements, the different components of becoming more like Christ, to become more a disciple of Christ. All of us have something that we're struggling to step into, right? We've worked ourselves up to getting right to that edge, to getting right to the brink of the water. But when push comes to shove, whether it be the flood level waters or whether it be the enemies on the other side or whether it be bitterness because we've been wandering for 40 years, whatever the reason is, we're not willing to step in to the water. But recognize, and again, this is not some affirmation text that God's a genie and is just going to snap his fingers and fix everything. But recognize that the same God that encouraged Israel, stand and watch me. And when you get out into the water, if you'll take that step, I'll provide. I'll dry the ground. I'll stop the water. Do you recognize that God's not a genie now, but God, the God that made that promise, is still the God we serve? He's not changed an iota. That's actually one of the core principles of who God is he is eternal, meaning he can't change. So the God that made that promise is still sitting and capable as he was then. And he's encouraging us, he's challenging us, step out, like the children of Israel. Tonight, if you aren't a Christian, we want to always offer the invitation. Again, there may be no better application for this than baptism, salvation. Again, all of this is pointing back to the greatness of God. And the greatest display of the greatness of God is Jesus. That Jesus came willingly as part of the triune God. He was God in the flesh, and he came and died on our behalf. You have the opportunity to be immersed for the forgiveness of your sins tonight. If you've never considered that, if you've never put on Christ, I want to challenge you. Take the step. You're at the water's edge. Take the step. Watch God pause the water. Watch God dry the land and allow you to cross. If that's your need tonight, we'd love to help you. If we can do anything for you, would you come and let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together?